It's especially nice to be able to talk about art that's informed by religion, because there are so many places where such a thing is set aside. The art world in general, galleries, museums, exhibition spaces, looks at religion sideways. They wonder if it's parochial, or they wonder what value it might bring to the discussion of art as art progresses forward. So to find a place that's actually courageous enough to wonder about art and religion together, like St. Vincent, is a really remarkable thing to find. You probably also are familiar with the gallery that Brother Nathan runs, and he runs the Catholic art exhibition every 2 years or so. And that's another excellent example of finding ways that art and contemporary life can be expressed together. So it's a really fortunate place to be. Before I show you some of my artwork and the artwork of my peers, I want to give you a sense of how I think about religion and how it found its way into my artwork. And one of those places is first, as a Jewish person, studying Torah, looking at the 5 books of Moses. And here's an illustration of what I participate in every Shabbat when I go to temple, when I go to synagogue. And here you see a text. It's the Torah, a particular set of texts, the 5 books of Moses, written in order on 2 scrolls. And it's read that way. So it takes about a year to complete. And when you're done, you have a party and you start all over again. That's how it goes. It's considered to be, by Orthodox communities, very religious or communities, divine, given by God, one source. Some people, me included, consider it written by multiple authors, but there's no real clear explanation as to who wrote what or where it came from. The other major source in Jewish education is the Talmud. And here it's written in books, in multiple volumes, and it comments on the Torah. But it also comments on other Jewish texts, things that relate to Jewish law. And some of that you can see here. This is the main header for the page. Just below that is something called the Mishnah, which is a particular volume, here cut into pieces. And then the rest of the page, the Gemara, tries to describe that little piece. And the rest of the page is written by multiple people in multiple voices, and it's very clear to see who said what. When you read it, it's like an argument. Well, I think this. Well, you're wrong, and this is why. Well, you're wrong because this is why. And it goes on in many different ways over and over again. So as you read it, you have to think about the different sources they're talking about. They're not only referring to that little bit of text on the same page, they may be referring back to the Torah. And it goes back and forth like this. So imagine trying to trace one idea through 30 volumes of text and one continuous scroll. It's a bit daunting. Every other word, depending on who you're talking to, refers back to a different section somewhere else. And Jonathan Rosen, who wrote a book called The Talmud and the Internet, sees the Talmud a little bit like the Internet. Everything is cross-referenced. To use contemporary language, everything has a hyperlink. He writes, I can't help feeling that in a certain respect, the Internet has a lot in common with the Talmud. The rabbis referred to the Talmud as a yam, or were the word for sea. And though one is hardly intended to surf the Talmud, something more than oceanic metaphors links the two. Vastness and an uncategorizable nature are something that defines both. The Hebrew word for tractate or volume, one of these volumes of books, is masechet, which means webbing. As the World Wide Web, only the metaphor of the loom, the ancient and inclusive, captures this randomness and interconnectedness. Rosen uses contemporary language to describe an ancient compendium of volumes, but more importantly, also describes how you're supposed to use it. You're supposed to float through the different references. You're supposed to bring what seem to be disparate things that are separate together into a form of interpretation. And some artists are trying to make their own interpretations with pictures. They're not just illustrating the story of, let's say, Abraham and Isaac or Adam and Eve in the garden. They're trying to use this interwoven, interconnected, multi-referenced method in their work. And they refer to that as visual midrash. Midrash, you can translate as interpretation. One example is Ruth Weisberg's work. She's a prominent feminist Jewish artist. And she writes, "I make art out of all aspects of my identity, finding in the process that art integrates my experience, beliefs, and heritage. I am particularly nourished by the history of art, the history of the Jewish people, and the unwritten history of women. I believe that art creates meaning and can be transformative both for the artist and the audience." So this is one little piece of a large work called The Scroll, and it runs 94 feet long. So it has the same formula or format as the Torah scrolls that you saw earlier. The stories run uninterrupted, one to the next, very much like the scroll would. And so here we see a woman and a child lying on a sheet. This section is called Genesis. What does that refer to? Or I'm sorry, it's called creation. It may refer to the beginning, because it's towards the beginning of the scroll. If it does, it's not necessarily Adam and Eve. Maybe it's Eve with one of her sons. And if that's the case, we've left Eden already. Sin has happened. She's now having children with Adam. So it's an unusual position to place the narrative if that's what's happening. More than likely, it's an experience of motherhood and remembering what it's like to have a small child with you, maybe on the living room floor or early morning lounging in bed with an infant. Another artist, Archie Rand, does something a little different. He's not interested in narrative so much. He's interested in laws. Here, it's called the 613. What's he referring to? Well, he's referring to 613 laws found in the Torah as written and figured out by Maimonides, a philosopher, rabbi, and from the medieval period. So he went through the text, Maimonides that is, and found 613 things we must do to live a just life. Don't worry, about 30 of them you can't do anymore because they refer to the temple in Jerusalem that doesn't exist. So you can cross those off our list and we can work on the rest. What does Archie Rand do? He makes a small painting for each of them. Very broad, very inclusive. So both of these artists try to be complete. The first person did a whole scroll representing maybe the entire Torah. And here Archie Rand is using images to do the whole law. Very broad, very big works. You can also do something a bit smaller in scale. And here we have Ken Goldman. He makes things that relay a message inside Judaica, or objects that are used in a ritual way. This is a Hanukkah lamp, or two of them. Maybe you're familiar with the Hanukkah holiday falling in line often in the calendar with Christmas. The tradition is to light 8 candles because during the miracle that it's celebrating is the fact that there was only enough oil in a lamp to stay lit for 1 night. It stays lit for 8 nights. As the Maccabees rededicate the temple, they light that lamp, and this miracle happens. God is recognizing their triumph over this rededication. The one on the right is made from little Christmas bulbs where their electrical components have been taken out. So that's now a Jewish lamp being made from something that was probably a different religion or for a different purpose. It reminds me of the idea of being a stranger in a strange land. You incorporate what's around you and use it in a new function. The one on the left, you can perhaps recognize that bottle as being an olive oil bottle. And for the holiday, not only do you light oil to commemorate the miracle, you eat fried foods, fried potato pancakes, fried donuts filled with jelly. And so this menorah on the on the left, suggests that eating the oil as well as lighting it. What do I look at? I look at the day of rest, Shabbat. And in that case, it's defined in a very particular way. You're probably familiar with the 10 Commandments, and in the Jewish outline of them, the 4th commandment describes the day of rest where you will do no work. But if you're a rabbi, you might ask the question, well, what is work? I certainly can get up and walk around. What am I not allowed to do? Work is defined in a very particular way. In English, we have a couple of words. You can think of toil, work, labor. And perhaps those different words conjure up different activities. Breaking rocks in a field, sitting at a desk typing. different kinds of labor, right? In Hebrew, there are two words, avodah and melacha. Avodah is very much like our word, work. Melacha, though, has a very specific meaning. Melacha is any activity that was done while the Israelites, as they went through the desert, built the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where God's presence came down and interacted with the priests. So to build that tabernacle, what did they have to do? They had to cut down trees. They had to smooth the planes of the wood. They had to erect the wood. They even covered those pieces of wood with gold. They made tapestries to cover the whole building. So any of those activities, weaving, cutting, smoothing, lifting, moving, are what they define as work. They included hammering to make the ark. They included heating to make the bread, all sorts of things. So observant Jews today look at this list of melacha, these 39 activities, and don't do any of them on Shabbat, on Saturday. I don't live with this restriction, but I observe Shabbat in other ways. This is the traditional rabbinic way to do it. Many of them look like craft ideas, weaving, marking, shaping. Some of them undo artistic things, erasing, extinguishing. Most of these are found in the Talmud, those volumes of text describing the law. Two of them are found in the Torah. So those seem to be a little bit more important if the Torah is divine and God said, don't do these two things. Those two things are setting a fire. Other religions and mythologies have a sense of fires being divine, given somehow. So I sort of understand a background for that. But the second one is carrying. Why is carrying singled out among all of these things as being so important that it's in the Torah and not just figured out by interpretation? First, we might want to ask, as the rabbi might do, what is it? And they define carrying in a very particular way. Yeah, it's lifting something and carrying it over there and carrying it back, which I can do. On Shabbat, on the Sabbath, if I'm an observant Jew, I could lift my couch and bring it downstairs. So it doesn't relate specifically to working and hard activity. It refers to also, I'm allowed to carry something outside as long as my garden has a wall. What's magical about that limit? Well, that fence in this picture shows where my private space is, where my home is, my garden wall is. I'm still home if I'm outside, as long as I'm inside my picket fence. I can carry into the garden. I can bring food down to the patio and have a picnic. But I can't go from my private space across that fence into the public domain. Once I carry in that manner, I've broken the law for Shabbat. This is how it's defined. So I accept their definition in my artwork, and I try and figure out where that might take us. There is one exception to this idea. Well, it's not really an exception. It's a way of extending private space into the public sphere. Imagine pushing that fence out a mile or two away from the house. It's still there, and I'm still within it, so I can still carry around a much larger field. That legal expansion is described in one part of the Talmud, and that's called the tractate Eruvim. It's defining this new line. Let's consider that line around a broader home an eruv. I've now pushed my fence back. The new, bigger fence I call an eruv, and I can now carry within this bigger space. Let's take another look at it. Suppose this is my house with my picket fence. You now sort of understand being within and without that place. My neighbor perhaps has the same thing. Perhaps my neighbor also lives by the same orthodox way of life. He can carry things down to his garden and have a picnic outside. I can carry my infant into the yard, let them crawl around for a while, and then bring them back into the house. Carrying is that strict. If you lift anything and move it, even a person, it's within this jurisdiction. Suppose there's a break between our two properties. the rabbinic law says now they're one property because there's no clear marking between those two places. Even more, if there's a break in the fence to the sidewalk, this whole legal fiction falls apart. The private space spills into the public street, and I can't clearly see where one end and one begins. I can't pretend that the garden is now my private space. It's conceptual. It's not literal. So the rabbis, to suggest a way to build community and say these two people live together so that they can bring food from one place to another, they can bring their children together and have a Shabbat afternoon together, suggests an answer. Build a doorway in that opening. Now it's clearly marked. Of course, then the question is, what's a door? They're very thorough legally. And so they define a door as something that looks like one, that has posts and lintel. There are several doors around this room. If I take off the top of the doorway, it's not legally, according to this system, a door. They also say it has to have a particular size or be within a certain limit. Why? Because if the door is so tall that when I pass through it, I don't notice it has a top, I don't realize I've left the area. Or maybe the door is so wide, I don't notice I've passed through an opening. So it can't just be any door. It has to be something that more or less, and I've highlighted it here, has the appearance of a door. Appearance? Isn't that a subjective, aesthetic idea? How can you judge law, which is what we're talking about, on an appearance idea? But they do. They even suggest and show ways of correcting a problem. Suppose you have an opening that's too wide, and I want to enclose or embrace several houses so that they can have Shabbat together and think of themselves as a communal home. Well, I can do that by intervening and simply putting up a post. Now I can see that it's a smaller space. It's subjective to me. It's particularly about the observation of the person. So how do you write law that says this is enough that everybody will recognize it? I'm not really sure you can, but they try. That's why there are hundreds of pages of descriptions of how to build an eruv. You can also put the post next to the other post. What's it doing there? Nothing. It just reminds us that that's the limit. It's not actually a structure. So now we have a sense of how this goes. But in lived life, today, we don't have these wooden door frames everywhere. You would have noticed them by now, probably. In this case, today we can replace the lintel with a wire. In this case, it sags too much. It should be perfectly straight so it has the same appearance of a door. Straight posts, straight lintel. Once you do that, well, you can replace the whole thing with that idea. And in fact, that's how most eruvs are built today, where they just replace fences with this conceptual door. I know, we look at this picture, we think telephone wires, we think power lines, but try to think of the legal code I've been trying to describe. Look at it as posts with straight lines running across those lintels. It's now a series of gates, conceptually, around these two homes. There's another side to this. You can't just expand the law and say, now we can carry as far as we want. Great, the wire is 10 miles from us. That wouldn't be in the spirit of rest. The other part of this is the idea that everyone needs to have a communal meal. We're expanding and sharing home so that we can come together. And that communal meal can now take place in the garden, between these homes, and the whole eruv, both the meal and the limit, would look something like that. So we blend our homes together by making this legal line that says, here's our shared garden wall. And we also share a meal together to say, yes, we are family, we are one community. I see these as a three-dimensional collage. I think like an artist. And the one in Squirrel Hill, here's the map, you've probably never even noticed. It's pretty big. It covers part of Frick Park. It goes into Squirrel Hill, the neighborhood. It goes as far as Shenley. It goes as far south as Greenfield. So there's a line running around this neighborhood. About here, where the new housing development is, there's a very steep incline. And you don't need to put up a string or a wall there. It's just too steep to climb, so no one would bother stepping down the hill. It's a natural boundary. Just about here on Forbes Avenue, if you're coming in from exit 77, if you're familiar, there's a cemetery on your right and a low stone wall that runs along the road. That's a wall that's already there. You don't need to use only string. That's too complicated. Use what's already in the environment. And then if you keep going, you'll hit South Dallas. Most likely, you'll get stopped at the light. And if you look very carefully at the entrance to Homewood Cemetery on your right side, here's another entrance around the corner. You see the string? Just below the stone ball. Here's another variation of it nearby. Here, let me help you. You're not supposed to really notice it. Only the community needs to know that it's there. And in fact, there's a person who comes around every Thursday, checks that it's up, and if there's a problem, probably calls the telephone company to come and fix it and pay them for it. So there's an Eruv in Squirrel Hill. I just showed you the map. There's an Eruv in Manhattan, and here are two maps showing its recent expansions. Think about that body of law that's required to get it right. The whole community is relying on the correct interpretation or agreed upon interpretations to say that now I can carry my infant across the street to a friend's house. Now I can bring food to a sick neighbor because we are all inside a communal home. Those values are shared by many religions to help the sick to get together to share a meal. And in this case, they need this line to enable that to happen on Shabbat. This is my work. I take the maps, I pare them down to their basic simple shapes. The line is stitched thread through the paper to emulate the wire that's sometimes used, often used, to finish an Eruv. And it's white on white paint, because the Eruv really is almost nothing. Here is the updated map, where I've included the white lines of the recent expansions. Venice, Italy has its own. These are all over the world. Here I've included the canals within that boundary. This is an historical neighborhood that's been around for centuries. I'm not sure how long the Eruv has been up. Excuse me, so walking in this city, you walk under buildings, over bridges. It's very much a walking city already. Here's another Eruv in Tel Aviv, Israel. And this covers a major part of the metropolitan area there. Recently, I've been using Google Maps to figure out how close together these different communities are. So here is Boston, just inside the highway numbered 128. The small little spot on the left side of the image is Brandeis University's Eruv. The big one in the middle is the greater Boston Eruv. Above it is Cambridge, and then a suburb up to the north. Did the same thing for London. The shape in the lower right is in the city proper, with its suburbs nearby. And looking at Washington, D.C., there are many that nestle up against one another. Here, if you can see in the detail, I included the diamond shape of the city limits. Some communities have overlapping interpretations. This is Beit Shemesh, another city in Israel. And there's one community that's so orthodox, they don't agree with the ordinary Orthodox that live among them. And they have two different overlapping maps. So these two different interpretations of law are expressed by these boundaries. They're actually both very religious communities. Some Eruvim, that's the plural for Eruv, inspire controversy. And there's a group who wants to build an Eruv in West Hampton Beach, Long Island. And within that community, there are some people who don't want to build this Eruv. And this controversy has grown so heated and popular that it was even spoofed on The Daily Show. The interviewer is confronting a rabbi with an Eruv hat, thinking of the Eruv as a loophole, presenting a cheeseburger. You're not allowed to eat milk and meat products together if you're an Orthodox Jew, tempting him with another loophole. Well, if one's okay, why not eat this? It's a hilarious segment, so I recommend taking a look at it. The artist who inspired that hat also thought of other ways of getting around the problem. Well, maybe a hoop skirt is enough, or a GPS-enabled hat would tell me when I'm inside and outside. Why do I need the wire with today's technology? I also played around with the eruv as an idea and did this drawing of a cityscape that runs from one panel to another, connected by wires, and it's drawn with one continuous line. I cheated a little because it goes from one panel to a wire to another panel, but here's a detail of it. And I represented the architectural details of the Mexican war streets where the mattress factory exhibition was held. I even drew on the windows to show that the drawing was accurate and lined up with the view. You notice somebody moved the chair that I'd drawn in the corner? I thought that was kind of funny. I also played with the idea of a piece of string. What's so important? Well, here's an instant eruv. Need one on your way home for the weekend? Pick one up. Set it up yourself. Dime store idea. Elliot Halkin takes it a little bit more seriously. He's trying to address a problem. If the wire gets cut or is cut, a tree limb falls on it or something, the eruv no longer works for that weekend. You have to somehow notify everybody and say, don't carry this weekend, we'll fix it for next week. So he thought, well, maybe instead of using wire, why don't we use a laser? Shoot it out from that window at the top of that painted post. Shoot it across the street, look at it inside of that television monitor on the left side of the image, and I don't have to go anywhere. I can see that the signal is making the circuit. Even better, if a tree limb falls through the laser, this fictitious line, or a truck that's too tall passes through it, nothing is broken. The laser heals itself. So he's using technology, he's playing with the ideas. I'm not sure it will pass muster with certain rabbis, but he's trying to push forward with this centuries-old custom. Other artists look at the social function behind the eruv, and one older eruv artwork is this one by Sophie Kalla. It's called the Jerusalem eruv. She went to that city, interviewed Israelis and Arabs, and asked them to take them to a public place they had a private memory of. So it's a bit more of an internal, emotional discussion between public and private. The interviews are placed on the table in text form on the map of the area, and she took photographs of the poles and lined the room with them. Another artist, Maya Escobar, a Jewish Latina artist, suggested something called the Berlin eruv. There is no eruv in Berlin. She went there and interviewed people and said, imagine the world that would exist if Berlin had one. And then they proceeded to talk for about 20 minutes about their impressions of the city, about what the Jewish community would be like there, about a sort of revisionist, triumphal return of Jews to that history of Europe. She conjures up the Holocaust and World War II without even mentioning it. It just appears in the discussions of these people. Recently, I showed my work at Yale University, and here's a slide or an image from that exhibition with me in it. It's kind of weird to see me in two places. With a work called 24-Hour Mobile Home, Corresponding Contingencies. It's made by Ellen Rothenberg. So what's the work? It's the backpacks on the wall, the lines on the floor, the table with shirts and plates on it. She founded Orthodox community where some of the people who lived there accepted the eruv's limit and agreed that we live in a common home. And then some of the people who lived there rejected it and didn't carry on Shabbat. Those people who didn't carry called the people who did carriers. And to Ellen, that sounded like a medical disease term. And so to represent the carriers, she made the backpacks with big Boy Scout-like patches that say carrier, and almost like scarlet letters, and patches of things that could go in the bags, like keys and books. For those who didn't carry and rejected this principle, she made the shirts lying on the table. Perhaps you can see that funny square and some other wiggles on them. She stitched closed all the pockets, very demonstratively and too much, to really say, I'm not carrying anything, there's nothing up these sleeves. to create this visual dialogue between two groups of people who live in the same place, who agree and don't agree on the application of Jewish law. I like this next view from the opposite side because it shows my work in the background, this debate among some Jews in their own community. And if you notice, there are pieces of flatbread sticking out of the table, matzah. And that symbolizes that shared meal that I referred to that you need to have to suggest we're all one family together. So this image shows the shared meal and the boundaries, which is really the complete eruv, not just the line. So I hope tonight I've given you an idea of some Jewish thinking, how Jewish interpretation can be applied, and then how I use it in my own work and the work of some other people using the eruv as their subject matter. Thank you very much for coming.